Innovator drug companies spend billions of dollars on R&D to bring a new drug to market. So protecting a newly launched drug's intellectual property, or IP, from copycats is crucial to recouping these investments and turning a profit.
Protecting pharmaceutical intellectual property is most often done through patents granted by each country's patent office for IP protection lasting around 20 years, and less commonly through trademarks and other means of protection. Another way to insulate yourself from generic competition is through exclusivity periods granted by each country's drug regulator, like the FDA in the US. Drug regulators provide an exclusivity period during which they do not approve similar drugs to balance the interests of an innovator with the need for price competition. The exclusivity period can last anywhere from a few months to a few years.
Getting a patent is the most sure-shot way to protect a new drug's IP. Patent applications need to be filed early, before the drug's components are published and applied for regulatory approval. Patents are geographic, which means a patent issued by the US Patent Office does not provide protection in India. In general, patents are issued if the owner of an invention is able to prove three things: that the new drug is truly novel and not just an improvement on an existing drug. 2, that it's not obvious to a skilled scientist that such a drug exists. And 3, that it is useful to treat real disease indications in the real world. The best thing to patent is a new drug compound, the active ingredient which gives the drug its therapeutic property. This could be a novel chemical molecule, its structure, or a biomolecule like a protein in a biologic drug. But patents can also be obtained for a chemical or manufacturing process used to make the drug. Under a process patent, the finished product itself is not protected. So others can make the same product as long as it is made using a different process. Patents can also be obtained for drug formulations, the unique proportion of active and inactive ingredients that go into a drug. Formulation patents can also cover unique characteristics of the drug, like extended release properties. And it can also cover uncommon dosage forms, like transdermal patches, which releases the drug through the skin. And finally, patents can be obtained claiming new uses for an existing drug. That is, the applicant can prove that an existing drug compound is effective on a disease indication for which it was not previously used. Many regulatory agencies provide protection for a new drug from generic competition for a set period after the drug's approval. Such protection, called exclusivities, is over and above any patent protection the new drug may have. Exclusivities are important for innovator drug companies because getting patent protection can be hard and expensive. In addition, a patent application is submitted as soon as a new drug compound is synthesized in the lab, and it's well into its patent term by the time regulatory approval is obtained, leaving the drug owner with a limited period of protection after approval. So innovator companies rely on regulator exclusivities to recoup their investments from specific markets. Exclusivities can take many forms, depending on the type of drug being approved. Here are some examples of exclusivities given out by the US FDA. New Chemical Entity or NCE exclusivity is for 5 years and is given for drugs based on a completely new chemical entity or active compound. During the NCE exclusivity period, the FDA will not accept applications for a generic version using the same chemical entity.
The only exception to this rule is generic applications filed with Para 4 certifications, in which case the FDA may accept the application 1 year before the NCE exclusivity period expires.
Orphan Drug Exclusivity or ODE, which runs for 7 years, is given to new drugs that treat rare diseases. This is to encourage companies to work on drugs for diseases which affect very few people and so has a limited market size. The 7-year exclusivity period is considered enough time for a company to recoup its costs and turn a profit even with a limited market size for orphan drugs. New Clinical Investigation or NCI exclusivity, which runs for 3 years, is given to a drug owner who has data from fresh clinical trials for a previously approved drug. Such data may prove that the drug is suitable for a new disease indication for which the drug was not previously approved. New investigations can also test for modifications of the original drug, like extended release mechanisms and new dosage forms. Clinical trials are the longest and most expensive phase of drugs development. So data obtained from clinical trials is valuable, and it's in the owner's interest that the same data not be used by competitors. Data exclusivity protects a company's clinical data from being used by others for 5 years. Pediatric exclusivity adds 6 additional months of protection if a drug owner conducts trials to prove efficacy of a new drug on children. So the normally 5-year NCE becomes 5 years and 6 months, and the 7-year ODE becomes 7 years and 6 months if the drugs are also tested on children. Generic drug exclusivity for a short period of 6 months is granted to the first generic version to be approved after an innovator's patent is expired. The US FDA came out with this exclusivity to encourage generic drug manufacturers and allow them a brief period of competition-free sales. Exclusivity periods are a way provided by regulatory agencies for drug companies to recoup their R&D expenditures.
Drug regulators around the world require tons of safety and efficacy data when a new branded drug applies for approval, a process which can take years to complete. With the US FDA, for example, a new branded drug is accompanied by a new drug application, or NDA. The NDA can be a long and arduous journey with many additional requests for data from the FDA before the drug finally makes it to the Orange Book of Approved Drugs. Because of this rigorous process, the FDA grants exclusivity to the approved drug, which means they will not accept other NDAs for the same indication with similar drugs for several years. Protection from exclusivity is over and above any patent protection the drug may enjoy. Regulatory approval for generic versions of synthetic drugs is relatively simpler because an identical branded drug has already been approved before. For generics, the FDA allows an abbreviated new drug application process, or ANDA, which is faster, cheaper, and can be done with limited trial data. However, an approved ANDA provides exclusivity protection for a much smaller duration, typically only a few months. As with everything else, the approval process for biosimilars is more complicated than chemical generics because they are not exact copies of approved biologics. Biosimilar approvals, in fact, are still a work in progress with changing requirements. The next few years will be critical in setting expectations as more patents on biologic drugs expire and more biosimilars attempt to enter the market. Regulatory approval for generic versions of synthetic drugs is relatively simpler because an identical branded drug has already been approved before. For generics, the FDA allows an abbreviated new drug application process, or ANDA, which is faster, cheaper, and can be done with limited trial data. However, an approved ANDA does not usually provide any exclusivity protection. Only specific ANDA submitted under Para 4 authorization provides even limited exclusivity periods, typically only a few months. As with everything else, the approval process for biosimilars is more complicated than chemical generics, because they are not exact copies of approved biologics. Biosimilar approvals, in fact, are still a work in progress with changing requirements. The next few years will be critical in setting expectations as more patents on biologic drugs expire and more biosimilars attempt to enter the market. Because ANDA applications for generics are based on a previously approved reference listed drug, or RLD, the generic owner must certify that no RLD patents are being violated. The FDA lays out the procedure for this certification through U.S. Code of Federal Regulations number 21 under Section 314. This section lays out 4 different ways to certify that there is no infringement in 4 respective paragraphs. Under Para 1 certification, the generic owner certifies that the RLD just doesn't have a patent. Under Para 2 certification, it claims that the RLD patent is now expired. Paragraph 3 certification claims that the RLD patent is about to expire before the generic drug can realistically get to market. Certification under these 3 paragraphs are straightforward, and the ANDA is approved as long as all other regulatory requirements are met. Under Para 4 certification, though, the ANDA owner claims that although the reference drug is patented, the patent does not apply to this particular generic version. The approval process becomes quite a bit complicated under Para 4 certification. First, the generic owner must send notice to the RLD owner that they have established bioequivalence with their product and lay out the reasons why the patent would not apply. After receiving this notice, the RLD owner has 45 days to file a lawsuit against the approval of the generic. If the suit is filed within this period, the ANDA application is put on hold for 30 months, time for the RLD owner to prove that their patent is being infringed. Regulatory bodies have played a historic role in protecting public health by keeping unsafe pharmaceutical products from reaching customers. Drug regulations exploded in the 60s and 70s as a response to high-profile accidents, like the thalidomide tragedy, which resulted in cancer and death for thousands of patients who took the drug. But as individual regulatory bodies moved quickly with new laws, it created a haphazard and non-uniform regulatory infrastructure around the world. This meant that a pharmaceutical company coming out with a new drug, even life-saving ones, had disparate requirements and waiting periods to launch in different parts of the world. So a life-saving cancer drug approved for use in the US could be kept out of Europe as the drug company went through an entirely different European approval process. The hardest hit was perhaps taken by the patients, who were left out of reach of breakthrough drugs available outside their countries. So starting in the 1980s, regulators were trying to harmonize the requirements for new drug applications, so that all regulatory bodies were reviewing essentially the same submission for the same requirements. Enter the International Conference for Harmonization, or ICH. ICH has one main mandate: to harmonize and simplify the approval process for new drugs around the world. Since its inception, ICH has issued 4 sets of guidelines to pharmaceutical companies for submitting new regulations. Quality guidelines on how to ensure the quality of drug substances, processes, and products. Safety guidelines to investigate new products' toxicity on different body systems. Efficacy guidelines with studies to check if a new drug will work on the disease or disorder as advertised. And finally, multidisciplinary guidelines, which lays out a common technical documentation or CTD format for submitting technical data to support new drug applications. These ICH guidelines have been adopted by over a dozen regulatory bodies around the world, including the US FDA. This is Ria, a famous burger chef. Her vegan burger is the talk of town. A lot of things go into making her burger, from the finest ingredients, experts, chefs and assistants, the top-of-the-line kitchen equipment, and a process to keep the kitchen clean and sparkling. To maintain the taste and hygiene of her burger, Ria has defined exact ranges for all of these factors, from the amount of salt to add to how her workers should clean their hands after using the bathroom. It's also important to have a plan in place for when things go wrong. For example, she may run out of vinegar and substitute it with baking soda, or an employee on the burger assembly line might call in sick, needing someone else to step in. In scientific parlance, all of these factors, their acceptable ranges, and contingency plans put together is called the design space. Ria's design space determines the quality of her burger. Just as in the case of the burger, the design space determines the safety and efficacy of final pharmaceutical products also. And just like the burger's ingredients, active pharmaceutical ingredients or API and inactive ingredients or excipients should be of high quality and in the right proportion to ensure final drug quality. Just like at the restaurant, there should be a well-defined process and employee training in place in the design space, or to cover for any unexpected situations, like an operator calling in sick or a particular API from China just not being available. Having a robust design space is not just important to ensure that the drug works as expected, but also to make sure that a regulatory submission for approval covers all eventualities. If the design space is too restricted, the approval process will also be very specific, with no scope for changes based on situations. So all regulatory submissions should have a well-defined design space. It should list out all factors that affect the design space and parameters for these factors. It should also show intended substitutions in case things go wrong, and the scientific basis for making these substitutions. An approved submission after this review means that there's no need to make repeat submission for every little change. A well-defined design space may be the single most important thing which improves the chances of regulatory approval. With this in place, regulators are less focused on micromanaging each aspect of your drug development and production process, because they know there's a plan in place. A well-defined design space, forming the backbone of regulatory submissions and assured product quality.
By the 1980s, healthcare inflation was getting to crisis levels in the US, fast becoming the leading cause of personal bankruptcies. A major cause of this healthcare inflation was rising drug prices. With an approved new drug application, or NDA, and patent protection, innovator drug companies were under very little pressure to bring down prices for their products. Under mounting public pressure, the US FDA came up with an abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA, for cheaper generic versions of innovator drugs in early 1980. But the innovator companies were actively resisting generic drugs, primarily by filing patent infringement lawsuits as soon as R&D work started on a generic version. There were very few ANDA applications and nothing was happening to high drug prices. So in 1984, the US Congress passed the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act. It was sponsored by Congressman Waxman of California and Senator Hatch of Utah. So informally, the act is referred to as the Hatch-Waxman Act. First, the act had some incentives for the innovator drug company. It granted a new approved NDA an exclusivity period where the FDA would not approve other drug applications for the same disease indication. This gave the innovator company protection over and above any patent. But the main part of the act was to simplify the ANDA procedure for generics. It prevented innovator companies from filing patent infringement lawsuits just because a generics company was doing R&D. And it laid out 4 different methods for a generics company to contest an innovator claim of patent protection, usually referred to as Para 1 to Para 4 certifications. And finally, Hatch-Waxman incentivized ANDA filing by providing an exclusivity period of 6 months for a newly approved generic drug. During that time, the FDA did not accept similar generic drug applications. Hatch-Waxman opened the floodgates for generic drugs into the US market, the largest in the world by far. And since its passage in 1984, the law has brought about a sea change in the use of generic drugs. Here are some statistics. In 1983, only 35% of innovator drugs whose patents had already expired had generic competition. Today, that number stands at 90%. And in 1983, only 13% of doctor prescriptions were for generic drugs. Today, generics make up over 90% of all prescriptions. Because generics have negligible R&D costs, Hatch-Waxman catalyzed the burgeoning drug manufacturing industries in low-cost Asian countries, especially India. It would not be a stretch to say that the biggest beneficiaries of Hatch-Waxman were patients in the US and drug companies in India.
Traditionally, a pharmaceutical product's value proposition has been pretty straightforward. A drug is safe, it works on the disease or disorder as advertised, and this has been proved in closely monitored, lab-controlled trials on animals and humans. But not enough attention has been paid to what the long-term economic and social costs of each drug really is. For example, over the past few decades, healthcare inflation, which includes pharmaceutical spending, has been rising much faster than overall inflation around the globe. So much so that the leading cause of personal bankruptcies in the US is an unforeseen medical bill. Or let's look at the social costs of OxyContin, a blockbuster opioid-based painkiller approved in the 90s. Its maker, Purdue Pharma, proved that OxyContin was safe and effective for chronic pain management through clinical trials. But 2 decades later, The terrible social costs of the opioid addiction tsunami triggered by OxyContin is plainly visible, like from the statistics from the US Health and Human Services. So these days, healthcare decision makers like insurance companies, hospital administrators, and governments ask questions beyond just safety and efficacy in the lab when purchasing drug products. They want to know, is the drug accessible to all sections of society? Does it serve the greater good? Does it work in the real world and not just in lab settings? And finally, is it really worth the price that the drug company is asking for? So before paying for a new drug, technology, or service, present-day decision makers require a total health technology assessment, or HTA, for the product or service. In countries with single-payer healthcare systems like the UK, Canada, and most of the EU, a new drug is evaluated by a central HTA committee, which passes on recommendations about the true socio-economic costs of the drug to the central government-run healthcare provider. And in countries without a centralized healthcare system like the US, HTA is conducted by a patchwork of committees, working for insurance companies, pharmacy chains, and even individual government agencies, who seldom communicate with each other. So before being approved for purchase, decision makers require that pharma companies submit a dossier containing the analysis of a drug's long-term economic and social outcomes to the HTA committees. This analysis is called the Health Economic and Outcomes Research, or HEOR, for each product. The HEOR contains not just safety and efficacy clinical data, but also the drug's long-term economic benefits and data on how the drug is doing in the real world. This helps the payers answer questions that we discussed earlier. HEOR, put together by drug companies, and HTA, conducted by buyers, together looks at the long-term economic and social impacts of a new drug. Most pharmaceutical products fall into two main categories. Over-the-counter drugs, like typical fever and cough remedies that can be picked up at the supermarket without a prescription, and prescription drugs, available only through pharmacies with a doctor's prescription. But beyond these, there are certain other drugs which are approved for treatment, but which have known, dangerous, even fatal side effects. In the US, the FDA may approve new drug applications for such a drug, but requires that the distribution of the approved drug is tightly controlled through a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, or REMS. Use of an REMS drug requires that the patients getting the drug be counseled about the serious side effects and given an opportunity to decline it, that the healthcare professionals, like doctors and nurses administering the drug, receive specific training, and that the administration itself occurs in highly controlled and supervised environment, like a doctor's office or the hospital. The FDA maintains a list of all current REMS drugs on its website, along with exhaustive information on each of these drugs and its distribution strategy. Let's take a look at an example. Adasuve, an REMS drug, is approved by the FDA for the treatment of schizophrenia, but it's known to cause fatal breathing problems in some patients right after taking it. So the REMS for Adasuve explains these respiratory side effects, lists the exact information to share with the patient, and instructs on how to monitor the patient in the clinic after giving the drug and what to do in case they experience breathing troubles. Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies, or REMS, the FDA's way of making sure that drugs with known dangerous side effects are administered safely.